Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to be meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump tomorrow. They've got a number of trade and economic issues on the agenda. So I'm going to be talking to Peter Morrow, who's a professor of economics at the University of Toronto, about what might come up in the conversation. Welcome to the interview, Peter.
It's great to be here.
Well, I've got three or four things I want to ask about that
hmm
Canadians are going to be interested in. The first one is the CUSMA, the Canadian-U.S. Mexico trade agreement. And
hmm
that's been the source of some consternation because many Canadians thought that once Carney and Trump were in conversation months ago about this, thought there would be an agreement by now. What can you tell us about the current state of negotiations?
So the agreement itself isn't supposed to come up for renewal until July 1st, 2026. So any sense of something getting done right now isn't obvious to me. The but it also makes negotiations now more difficult when there's a major review on the horizon. So I wouldn't expect any major changes for the next little while. I think that both sides are going to be trying to develop a framework and trying to develop a relationship in terms of getting that renewal to go as smoothly as possible for both sides.
The last time you and I talked, Donald Trump was applying tariffs willy-nilly all over the world, including on some Canadian products, and some of them, the tariffs were applied, then taken off, then modified. Then it was chaos. Have things settled down on that front?
They've settled down to the degree that nothing has changed too much lately. So it's a elevated but stable level of protection. The the one thing that I would like to bring up is that a lot of Canadian exports to the United States are still tariff free because of the CUSMA agreement. And this is really what makes renegotiation of that agreement important because if that agreement falls apart, then the tariffs that Canada faces in the US are really going to go up because they won't get that, because Canada won't get that exemption anymore.
There was an ATB financial survey of energy executives that came out a couple of weeks ago in Alberta. And one of the things that was interesting is that, according to energy executives, and this would be mostly oil and gas, the issue of Trump tariffs on energy import or exports to the United States is a non-issue. That, from their point of view, it's done and dusted, and is not likely to come up again. Would you agree with that?
I mean, I think I trust people who are in the trenches. Uh, they probably know exactly what's going on. The issue with energy is that there is sort of this sense in which Canada and the US are t tied together at the hip. A lot of the upper Midwest in the United States really has to import its oil from Canada. It can't get it from anywhere else. So any disruption to those flows would really hurt US consumers, especially in the upper Midwest. So it doesn't strike me as being a battle that the current US administration wants to pick. And my guess is that that's where the executives' sense of peace, if you will, I guess, is coming from.
I interviewed somebody from the U.S. Energy Administration, Information Administration, a couple months ago, and there is 5 million barrels a day of refining capacity of the kind of heavy crude that Alberta produces. What I didn't
hmm
know is three
hmm
quarters of that was built specifically for Alberta heavy crude, and you can't just, flick a
Right.
switch and switch to something else. And I rather suspect that President Trump didn't know that. And when it was pointed out to him and all the difficulties that would ensue, that might have had something to do with him pulling in his horns.
That's definitely possible. The oil industry is something that I think a lot of people are playing catch up on relative to insiders like yourself. The the immediate reaction is that, oh, this is a freely traded commodity. All of our classic understandings sort of kick in. But then as you mentioned, when you start understanding that it's sort of a bilateral monopoly between these two countries, the relationship gets really complicated and both everyone's going down with the ship if trade relations deteriorate dramatically.
Yes, we early on. I'm going to brag a little bit here, Peter, because early on we were arguing that well, when Trump was threatening tariffs on energy imports into the U.S., we argued that in fact the it was the supplier of the oil, not the customer of the oil, that actually had the leverage in this dispute, and that Canada should lean into that. Now, it didn't turn out that way and everything is kind of settled down,
Yeah.
but it kind of played out the way we thought it might play out. Anyway, on to the next question. Um,
Hmm.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has promised an industrial strategy and a set of industrial policies to move
Hmm.
forward his agenda of diversifying the customers for the Canadian economy.
Hmm.
And is that going to be on the table for the discussion with President Trump?
It's definitely possible. I don't think it's obvious. When you think about Canada trying to diversify its customer base, it's trying to diversify it away from the United States, if anything. And I can't imagine Carney sort of coming in and Prime Minister Carney coming in and bragging about that. And I also think that he would probably be smart enough to not try and use it as leverage. I think it's something that will probably, I mean, there's many facets to this industrial policy, such as permit reviews, expedite uh, reviews that are sped up. And I think this is something that's largely going to be going on in the background and is not something that the two parties would negotiate over.
What other economic issues might come up for discussion between the two?
It's hard to tell. There's lots of things that the U.S. administration can bring up without with very little notice. I think it's important to really temper expectations on this. I think this is best viewed as being a relationship building trip towards the 2026 renewal. I could see possibly some minor small side deal on tariffs on metal like steel, but for the big stuff, I don't see any change anytime soon. And I think this is really going to be both sides trying to feel each other out for future negotiations.
See, that's an interesting point because Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and leader of the
Mhm.
opposition, has been banging on the Prime Minister on, you promised us a renegotiated agreement. We haven't had one. What's the matter with you? It's the typical
Mhm.
politics stuff. But what that does is it raises the profile of that issue in the media and in the public consciousness. But it sounds like this really, now that things have settled down, it's really about this long term, as you say,
Yeah.
relationship building. And we're not going to see a renegotiated agreement prior to the review next year.
Yeah, I'm not a pro I know better than to be a prognosticator, so I'm not going to issue a formal prediction as to when it's going to get done, but I wouldn't expect any major agreement or major restructuring before the renewal next summer.
Are there any economic aspects to the conversation the two leaders are going to have around security and defense cooperation? There's been this talk about
Right.
Canada participating in the Golden Dome idea that Trump has floated, that sort of thing.
Hmm. I mean, I think, with the legal justification for tariffs right now, security is whatever you want it to be. Steel tariffs are security. I think kitchen cabinets were security recently. So, what is security? I think that's the first thing I would say to that because security seems to be a moving target. In terms of things that more traditionally thought about security, such as defense spending, that actually strikes me as being what economists call a mutual coincidence of wants. Canada probably wants to become slightly more self-sufficient. The United States probably wants Canada to pay more of its own military bills. I can easily see that both leaders agreeing to that Canada will spend more money on military infrastructure. In terms of a some sort of dome over North America, that's definitely possible. I think one of the things that I always sort of have in my mind when we talk about these types of topics is I feel like the existential issue for Canada is if it wants to be closer to the United States or further from the United States. And those types of military agreements are sort of front and center when you ask that question.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for this. We'll maybe touch base with you later on after we find out what the leaders talked about. But thank you.
It's my pleasure. It's been great talking to you.